Okay, and let's see, one of the other memories I had after the picking up the coal on the streets and all that stuff and on the yards would be my dad had the affliction of the disease of an alcoholic. I mean, and him and many others, I'm sure, shared the same disease. And prohibition had ended in the early 30s, I guess, and so there was still a need for bootleggers in the mid 30s, and it was not unusual for me to be taken by my dad. He'd go down to the barber shop, just down the street. You walk down the barber shop. You walk in there, and I'd sit out there in the waiting room, and him and the barber and a couple other of his friends would walk out into the back room and sit there drinking moonshine for hours, and I would sit there waiting. And my brother can tell you the same story. And it's a disease that he never got over, and so therefore, those are my early parts of Carbondale, Pennsylvania. We moved to Massachusetts. Um, I think I was in my first year of school, halfway through the year when I moved to Massachusetts. We My dad worked in a paper mill when he first got there. I had an uncle that worked in the paper mill also, and I guess he got him a job there. That's why we moved there in the first place. Lived in a rent house, and kind of a deal back then. You moved in a house, you had to have paper and paint the walls and so forth. So you had to do it on your own. So it wasn't part of the rent. You did it. Obviously, you didn't get the rent. You rent the house. But then in the paper mill, there was a bunch of people that were the same problems. They drank a lot. You know, we never had at that point ever had a relationship with our parents. I mean, my mother worked from the time we moved to Massachusetts until the day she died. I mean, until she retired. And so she worked her whole life. So me and my brother, we grew up with no supervision as far as, you know, discipline or things of that nature. No compassion. I mean, I never got held by my parents. My father never spent time with me at all except beatings and chewing your ass out. I mean, that's pretty bad. But he never held many jobs. I mean, he'd get job. He had a lot of jobs, but never held a job. He would get a job and he'd work for 3 or 4 months, and he'd get to drinking and he'd miss work and he'd get fired or he'd quit or whatever it might be. By then you stop paying rent, so you get kicked out of that apartment. You go someplace else, and you move 3 or 4 places. We lived in a little small town of Russell, Massachusetts. We lived in 1, 2, 3 different houses in probably 4 years. So you never stayed too long in one place. And I'm sure each one I don't know for a fact, but that seems to me like we probably got kicked out for not paying rent. We wound up in Westfield, Massachusetts, in a place called the Brickyard. There's only 5 houses, 6 houses in a little community, and it was they had clay pits. They dug clay out of the ground. They dug clay out of the ground. They took it to the little place. They formed bricks. They baked them, sold bricks. So it was a big business. They hired a lot of people. My dad got a job working there night watchman. Night watchman meant you worked 11 o'clock until 7 o'clock at night, and you had to watch these charts on a wall for cooking the bricks. You had to keep them the same temperature. So you watch the chart, and if it started to go down in temperature, you go outside and you shovel some coal into the fireboxes, and you'd watch, and that's what he did all night long, and drank. Everybody who worked in that brickyard, at that particular job, night watchman, excuse me, there'd be second shift and third shift. They were called night watchmen. And when he would go in at night to relieve the second shift watchman, that guy would be drunk. And he would go home, and my dad would be drunk when he got there, so he would be, you know. So, and they keep changing people around, but every time you got there, somebody be drunk. I mean, working those jobs, it was just the low totem pole job. I mean, you didn't have no chance for advancement. So we lived there for until I got into high school, and then started from then till I think we lived there for probably 5 or 6 years in the brickyard. And my dad would feel free to take me and hire me out. I was working in tobacco fields at 12 years old. You couldn't work it legally in tobacco until you're 14, but at 12 they hired me and let me work half a day, and they pay you so much an hour, like 35 cents an hour, something like that. And you work 4 hours a day. At noon they bring you home, and then I would save my money, put it in a can, change, and then they had a couple of farmers that had the area that had these small little farms. One guy had like 8 or 9 cows. Didn't have any land, and he'd just have to bring his cows out. And he'd put them on chains, and he'd chain them up in different fields around the neighborhood. And the people let them use their field, and the cow would keep the grass mowed, right? And he would farm me out and tell me to a farmer, and the farmer was a drinking man too. So they met in a bar. My dad said, "My son can do this work for you." I go out at night from school, go from school at night, and about 6 o'clock at night, or in the wintertime at 5 o'clock when it gets dark, just getting dark, go out and take this, round up the cows wherever they're at in different parts of the neighborhood. That might be a half mile apart. You know, get them on that chain, and you bring them back to the barn, and you milk them. And so they get paid a quarter a day for doing that. I get a quarter, take them, put it in my little can. I save a can of coins, and man, that can was almost half full, heavy. You know, I had it hidden in the pantry, and one day I had a chance to buy a bike for $25, brand new bike. I said, man, I can give them a down payment. I must have $10 or $15 in that bucket. I take the can out and dump it out, and it's full of washers. I said, well, somebody drank it up, right? So, kind of like,
Wow.
kind of like, but then you think about it, in the respect, you think, well, it's pretty bad. It was pretty bad, but I thought it was bad at the time. But seeing that, living through it, it probably taught me a lesson that you don't want to be that way when you're getting older. You know, you want to take and avoid the problems that disease brings with it. And it was a disease, because I can never remember my father holding me, taking me any place by myself. I can never remember him telling me he loved me. He was always either scolding you or spanking your belt, leather belt. And it was not a pleasant bringing up, you know. And but I can remember his brother, my dad's brother, was the same way. And I'm sure some of my aunts were probably the same way. There's only 2 boys in that family out of 10, so there's 8 girls. I'm sure a lot of them had the same disease, you know. But my uncle, he got over it after many years of trying to get over it. He finally succeeded. He lived to be a pretty ripe old age for a guy who had a drinking problem. And my dad, he died at 54 years old. So
did he ever try to quit?
No, not that I ever know. If he tried to quit, I never saw one day that he didn't. So if he tried to quit, it wasn't for a full day. I mean, I can't recall ever seeing a guy sober. I mean, it just sounds like a joke, but never did. So, you know, he would when he was working, we lived in 2 rooms, 2 very small rooms, and that was your kitchen, living room, bedroom, bathroom, all combined. And there was curtains for the bathroom. I mean, just a curtain around the toilet. That was your bathroom. And if he had a job, he'd be working during the day, and he'd be home at 4 o'clock or 5 o'clock. And if your kids were there, he didn't want the noise of kids being around. He'd make you go outside. It could be raining. It could be hot day. It could be snowing, sleet, freezing rain. You get outside and play. You never had you never had the luxury of staying in a house. And actually, it wasn't really worth it. You don't want to be in a house anyways. Now that kind of a, you know, an attitude, that kind of a situation. So that's pretty much. And my mother, of course, she'd be working all the time, so she didn't have any control over us either, you know. So my brothers all tell you the same story. You know, you work delivering papers in the morning and night. The money you get for you had to turn over to the old man. You didn't get any money out of it. You got nothing. So you're working for everything, and nothing happens. So it wound up really being a bad situation, but probably a good learning experience. I try to look at the positive side, and I try to look at it. In the last few years, I've been looking at it saying, well, I'm trying to make excuses for him. Like he had a disease and he couldn't control it. But then again, how many people have that disease and do control it? You have to go out of your way to make the effort. And if the effort isn't made, you don't, so it gave me an opportunity and later after an incident that I'm not sure if I should go into this, but I guess I will. When I first came out of high school, I was living in a house. It was a rent house, and he worked in a paper mill. And he lived in the mill owned the house we lived in, so they took the money for rent and electricity out of the paycheck that he worked. Mm-hmm. So that way they collected their rent. We lived in a house for, I guess I was in high school. And I was, the last year that we lived in that house, he had not worked. He had got fired for drinking.